Were you with a toxic person that wanted you to show up or wanted you to be vulnerable, but you never got the same from them? Like it was almost like a double standard of they wanted to see a certain level from you, but then they weren't honest or they weren't willing to communicate the things that really need to be communicated. If you guys are new here, my name is Ben Taylor. I'm a self-aware narcissist on this channel to provide awareness, growth, healing, and change. I'm the founder of Raw Motivations, the creator of the Narc app, and your guide in the 45-day Clarity Challenge that you can access at claritychallenge.net. If you like what you see here, and we talk about narcissism, narcissistic abuse, the things that affected me on a day-to-day basis because of my narcissistic personality disorder, would love to have you keep watching and subscribe and keep an eye out for other videos that we drop. So hit that notification so you can see when we drop new videos and also when we go live on the platform. Well, today we're talking about the aspect of a narcissist oftentimes wants you to be vulnerable, but they don't have to be. Like they don't have to show up with that vulnerability. And I think it's key when we even introduce the topic of vulnerability is it's scary, period. A lot of people are scared of being vulnerable no matter what. Scared of being hurt, scared of being open, exposed, all those different things. And it's even harder when there's double standards with it. When one person expects something out of you, but they're not willing to contribute as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about definition of vulnerability, the fear of vulnerability, and the double standard that it has on you. So diving in, vulnerability. When we talk about that, it's defined as the idea of being open, exposed, being seen, being known. And the hard thing is all of that is the possibility of getting hurt. The possibility of something happening to you or because of something you've shared or opened up about that could bring about pain. And the hard part is without that vulnerability, like you don't have the possibility of that trust being formed. Because through vulnerability, that's where the trust is formed. And that's where you get the intimacy, the connection, the emotional connection that brings you to a whole nother level by one person being vulnerable with the other and the other person receiving that and being vulnerable back. When there's no vulnerability there, it is very hard and I would say impossible to develop any type of intimacy with another person. With the vulnerability, the piece is it's really hard to be vulnerable because of what actually happens when you're vulnerable in those moments. Now, a lot of people struggle being vulnerable, period. But when we talk about it from a narcissist aspect, it's hard to be vulnerable because it typically exposes what's actually hidden, what's actually behind the mask. And when we talk about vulnerability in general, a lot of times it's very hard because of either the abuse or the trauma or the shame that's connected with that aspect of being vulnerable. Well, narcissists fear vulnerability. It's one of the things that is very scary, that is very hard to be able to work through. And you need to understand with a narcissist, sometimes this is where they'll confuse you. They'll confuse your mind when you start to think that they're actually vulnerable. What I would question to you is how are they actually being vulnerable? So many times people think a narcissist is being vulnerable at the beginning of the relationship and they get connected and they're all like building the sympathy and empathy and all those pieces. But a lot of times the narrative is the vulnerability that they have at the beginning of the relationship is oftentimes fake vulnerability. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean vulnerability that is way back in the past or is something that has happened to them that gives the illusion that they're actually vulnerable now in the present. However, when you start to notice that the honesty doesn't match up, of how they engage and share with their feelings, of how they're open about what they're actually experiencing in the moment, you start to realize that what you've experienced has been a fake vulnerability to set you up for the sympathy, the empathy, the trauma bond that they're working on building in your life. So when we talk about vulnerability, you need to understand it's important that that vulnerability that we're talking about is not about the past. Narcissists will use that to leverage. It's about right here, right now. Well, with vulnerability in narcissism, one of the reasons why a narcissist will be afraid of it is exposure. Exposing who they are to the world. Taking that mask down and having to reveal the shame and the guilt that's actually inside. Oftentimes people think the best way to get rid of a narcissist is exposure, which oftentimes can be very dangerous. But sometimes with that exposure, it actually reveals what's underneath, and then that person no longer wants to be around you because of how it feels. You see, underneath that exposure is that shame, is the guilt that a lot of narcissists are running from, shame avoidance. And as a result, a narcissist builds a mask. They build a mask that they can hide behind so that they don't have to deal with the guilt and the shame and the things that they're struggling with on a day-to-day basis of who they are, of what they've done, how to be accountable, how to be responsible for those things. And as a result, they haven't had a good opportunity or a chance to figure out, understand, or learn how to actually deal with guilt and shame. Well, when we talk about vulnerability, vulnerability is needed, like very needed ground level for any type of change. That's where it messes people up with narcissists, because narcissists typically aren't going to change. Why? Because they're unwilling to be honest. They're unwilling to be vulnerable about the shame that's actually deep down inside. So as a result, they continue this loop and this cycle that they're going to continue going through, whether that's person to person, whether that's a shame cycle, whatever it might be. They continue doing this cycle instead of being honest with who they actually are, because that's exposing, that's vulnerable, and that's really scary. Well, a lot of times you're not going to see that vulnerability. Because of that exposure, they'll turn it around, they'll blame it on you, they'll project it back on you, anything they can do, then have it actually expose them. But there's a double standard here. There's a double standard because a lot of times a narcissist doesn't want to be vulnerable with you and won't be, but they expect you to be. They expect you to be the person that actually shows up, interacts, and tells every little detail about yourself, that opens up wide open, that they have full access to your phone, they have full access to your location, all of your messages, everything. It's like, I need to know everything about you. You can only know the things about me that I want you to know. You can only know the things about me that help support the mask. But I need to know everything about you. That's what they want. Be vulnerable, but not them. Okay? Oftentimes this is hard because it gets to a place where you get confused because they either lack the vulnerability or they fake it. Like the fake vulnerability that we talked about, they either don't have the vulnerability at all, they don't never show it, or they fake it. And this produces a lot of emotional turmoil of what is actually going on? What do I believe? What do I do? It starts to build cognitive dissonance, develops a trauma bond. All these different things happen because of this oftentimes. The confusion happens because it's required for you to progress in the relationship. If you don't have vulnerability, there is no progression. You can't get better at interacting with another person if you don't know them. And oftentimes that's the hard piece that people don't like to see coming out of the relationship. That the person that you thought you with, you don't know. Because they never were truly vulnerable and they never were truly honest with you. And as a result, you're left wondering what was real, what's actually going on, who am I? All these different things plague your mind because of that and because of that lack of vulnerability with another person. Oftentimes, it's left developing only just a shallow-minded relationship, a shallow, one-sided relationship from the narcissist because there's no depth there. Without vulnerability, you cannot go deep. You cannot develop a relationship that is deeper than just a superficial, shallow relationship. So you need to understand that vulnerability is required for change. If you don't see that vulnerability, if it's not something that is demonstrated on a day-to-day basis or something that you can track and see it is growing in this relationship, it is growing with this toxic person. If you don't see that vulnerability at all, then leave. If you don't see that honesty, that vulnerability, or that consistent change, then you need to walk away. Because you're stuck in a relationship that is not actually going to progress or deepen its depth in emotional intimacy and connection to help you grow, heal, change, and develop. You need to understand vulnerability is required for change, for growth, for healing, and for development. Without that vulnerability, you can't change. Without that vulnerability, you can't see when actually moving forward. Vulnerability is a requirement when working with me one-on-one. It is a requirement when being in the 45-day clarity challenge. It is a requirement to be in our Thriver Mastermind, to help people actually see you have to be vulnerable, but not just with other people, with yourself. Because if you're not willing to be vulnerable and honest with yourself, there is no hope of progression. So many people want to get to point B without acknowledging where point A is. So many people talk about goals and dreams and everything of like, I want to get here, but we don't take a look at what's going on right here. Being honest with where you are right now is one of the biggest things you can do to transform your life. Because that's the foundation. That is the baseline of where you need to be. And so many people are unwilling to confront the pain, to walk through that, to get to the place of saying, this is where I am. Is that place great? No, it sucks. But acknowledging first where you are helps us build a path to being happy, healthy, healed, and whole moving forward. But that comes with the price of being honest with yourself and being vulnerable with what you're experiencing and what's going on. Part of the goal of us building the 45-day clarity challenge is to provide a framework for you to walk through the steps of learning how to be vulnerable, learning how to engage with your emotions, and learning how to put that out there to a safe community that's going through it at the same time as you. The people that are going through the same exact struggles, from the relationship to the custody battle, to the divorce, to the abuse, going through the same stuff to be able to say, hey, we understand. We're right there. We're working with you to do that. But the only way to change and grow is to be vulnerable. There's people that have engaged in that challenge, that they've come in and they've been like, nope, I'm not going to share. I'm not going to engage. Those are the people that are still running from their healing. Those are the people that will not get the benefit of the vulnerability, of the declared word or the declared text that's saying, hey, this is what's going on. Once you write it down, that's why we talk about journaling. Once you write it down, once you expose it, it starts to become real and it starts to become something you can actually change. But until you acknowledge it, identify it, become vulnerable about what you're dealing with, there is no change. There is no growth to move forward. Without vulnerability, there is no change. You might be feeling crazy, alone, left with everything going on, like there is no possibility. I want to let you know today the possibility and the hope and the potential is in you for your growth, for your healing, for your change, for your development. I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not alone, you're not hopeless. Reach out for help.